This is Judaism Unbound, Episode 30, Seder Masochism. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
And we're here today continuing our discussion of Jewish art and artists with Nina Paley. She is an animator well known for her full-length feature film, Sita Sings the Blues, about the Hindu Ramayana. And she is currently at work on a full-length feature film called Seder Masochism, which turns her eye to the Exodus story and the Passover Seder. We've been following her work for quite a long time. She blogs at blog.ninapaley.com, and as a well-known activist against copyright, she shares freely and shows us her work in progress on her website. So we've been actually watching bits and pieces of this movie for quite a few years now, and Nina, we are so excited to have you on the podcast to talk about your work.
Thank you for having me.
I was thinking that we could just sort of start. I think that not all of our listeners are probably big comics or animation aficionados. And I think maybe it would just be great if you could tell us a little bit about what this project is that you're working on, Seder Masochism.
Seder Masochism. It is if I ever finish it, it will be my second feature film. My first feature film was Sita Sings the Blues, an animated musical, and Seder Masochism will also be an animated musical. Sita Sings the Blues was based on the Indian/Hindu epic, the Ramayana, and Seder Masochism is based on the story of Exodus, my introduction to which was being raised observing Passover as a child. So it's my take on the Passover story.
And I mean, just from an outside observer standpoint, well, what can we say about it? I mean, what's so interesting about the way that you work is that you're releasing pieces of the film as you produce them, and you just put on your blog, and you just put that you're done with a certain segment of the clips, the musical animated clips, right? And now you're going to be doing other type of work on it. And so I've been following it for probably 2 years now, and each clip is just this sort of amazing take on one segment of the Exodus story where you basically find some piece of music, an American piece of music that captures a lot of the spirit of it with, its own sort of ideas, and you're animating partly to the music, partly to the Exodus story, and creating this incredible synthesis with these incredible characters. Moses' face is in the shape of the Ten Commandments, and other characters' faces are in the shapes of other Jewish symbols. But, one of the things that's interesting in watching it as a observer reading your blog is that, in no way do I yet know how the pieces are all going to fit together. And looking at your movie, Sita Sings the Blues, you kind of have 3 or 4 different genres that are intertwined with one another. And I'm really excited to see what's going to happen here. If you could spoil it, are you doing kind of a straight sort of chronological telling of the Exodus story here, or is it something more complex?
Yeah, it's not going to be the Exodus. It's going to be my take on Exodus, which is different than other people's takes. Although there's nothing really made up in there. It's all based on I don't want to say based on a true story. It's all based on a old story. One of the segments that will be in the film is going to be an interview I did with my dad shortly before he died. And I was asking him questions about why he raised us observing Passover, given that he's an atheist, but he was raised Jewish. He comes from a really religious family. And I wasn't really close to my dad. We didn't get along that well, which you will be able to tell when you hear the interview. But since it was his decision to raise us observing Passover every year, I was just curious, how did he get to this point? Why did he become an atheist? What happened? He used to be so much more religious. And why, of all the holidays we could observe, why was it Passover? And just why? So it's an interesting interview. And that is, one piece of the puzzle. I know so many people that have never been to a Passover Seder, and if I could give them the experience of what is it like? You sit down, everybody has a book that they're reading from. You have a leader, and there's sort of a call and response sort of thing that happens in songs. And for me, it's really familiar, but I have many friends that just never had this. So I would like to, at least a tiny bit, simulate a Seder experience for people. But I don't really know how I'm going to do that in a feature film that's only going to be 80-some minutes long, given that Passover Seders, part of the Seder experience is that they're long and boring and last forever.
Well, maybe that's part of the experience that could stand to have some modification.
Yeah, and the things that I thought were required for a Seder, it turns out aren't actually necessarily in that. Like asking the 4 questions, that's just lumped under discussion of Exodus. It's not like a separate point, whereas all these, pouring, drinking and pouring and washing and stuff is part of it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely 100% true. The 4 questions traditionally comes in that Magid section, which is, the telling of the story. But I think you bring up an interesting point that we've actually been talking about, which is this idea that particular rituals are prescribed to be in a definitive, particular way. And we've been talking about how we might start to think outside of that. And maybe one day we will be able to experience Seders that contain elements of that, but also different ones. And I'm curious to hear, because you mentioned that you want it to parallel a Seder in some form or another. Do you envision people using this at their own Seders, or do you see it as separate?
Well, one conception I had of it, I don't know if it's going to come out this way, but I thought it could be like this horrible technological dystopia Seder substitute. Like you're not actually with people, you just, but you have this video and you could just, read along with this pathetic video Seder in lieu of human beings. I mean, I don't know. There are so many different ways that people have Seders. People certainly could use this as part of their Seder. But I think what most people get out of Passover Seders is being around friends and or family and or loved ones and having like a human experience.
Well, I'll tell you that just watching your film, or the pieces of the film that I've seen, are more inspiring and more enjoyable than I would say 98% of the Seders that I've ever attended, and maybe 100%. So I wouldn't minimize the possibility that, in a sense, watching the film could be, granted, not the family get-together part and the human get-together part, which actually, in my experience talking to people about Seders that they've attended and asking them what really moved them in the Seders that they attended, almost to a person, you hear the family get-together dimension, what I call the Thanksgiving element of the Seder.
Huh. That's interesting, because so I know a lot of people in the free culture, free software movement, a surprising number of them being like me, like of secular Jewish backgrounds, and gotten together with these friends and talked about it. And we're all like obsessed with liberty and freedom. And we were sort of thinking, well, is there something to getting together once a year and making the idea of freedom and liberation this, central, important concept? I don't know. But I will say that I'm really of two minds about Passover and Exodus. When I was growing up, I had never read Exodus, right? I didn't actually read Exodus until I started this project. And, actually reading the books of Moses is not recommended because they are horrific and they will turn you into an atheist, which is probably what happened to my dad. I'm a born-again atheist now. Before I was a lapsed atheist, but having spent 3 years with my face stuck in Exodus, I'm like, no, I'm a real atheist now. So I'm of two minds about it, which is like, it's a really horrific story. And it's not actually about universal liberation. It's not about the abolition of slavery. It's just, Jews aren't to be slaves, but Jews can certainly have slaves. There's a lot of misogyny in there and just, well, you don't even want to, you know what I'm talking about.
Let me back up for a second and ask you, what inspired you to make this particular movie and to explore this particular thing at this particular time?
That's a great question. There are many things that had to do with it. One of them being my father's death, his decline in death. This was a couple years after Sita Sings the Blues was done. And there was some controversy around Sita Sings the Blues. My Hindu collaborators, particularly the voices of the shadow puppets. When I was being attacked by Hindu nationalist fundamentalists, which exist, they're busy ruining India right now, they would refer to my Hindu collaborators as, quote, self-hating Hindus. And I was like, I've heard that. heard that rhetoric. My people came up with that rhetoric. And it brought me back to the days when if you didn't like really militantly support Israel, you were called a self-hating Jew. And it was like this rhetoric just sort of came back, right, with the controversy around Sita Sings the Blues. And it was like, this really bugs me. And I was also, of course, getting hate mail for Sita Sings the Blues from people who assumed I was Christian because I'm American and I'm white-ish. And they're like, how would you like it if we made a movie about the Bible? And I was like, that would be awesome. And how would you like it if we made a movie, about your religion? And I was like, that would be really awesome. And they also would be like, you wouldn't dare do something about the Quran. You wouldn't dare do something about a Muslim story. And it just so happens that this is, in fact, a Muslim story, the story of Exodus, and that Moses is a major prophet of Islam. So all these things together, it was like, well, clearly I have to do this. Like I was just pulled towards it. Oh, and then another thing is identity politics, right? Like it was just okay. So, by being white and American and doing this thing about something that is Indian and Hindu, I stepped into a shitstorm, and it was like I didn't have the right identity, right? It was like, it didn't matter how much I cared about the story. The important thing were my parents Indian Hindus? And they were not. And it's like, well, then you have no right to do this. There's this very widespread idea that somehow with your genetic material, you inherit the right to explore certain kinds of culture and not to explore other certain kinds of culture. So because I am defined as Jewish, because, it's not just my dad who's Jewish, my mom also, although she didn't come from a religious family, but this whole question of how do you even define what a Jew is, right? But, ethnically, culturally, whatever, I'm Jewish. So that gives me an entitlement to do this story. And I call it a Jew card. Like, I did not have a Hindu card, but I do have a Jew card, and I actually made a Jew card, which you might have seen on my blog. And it's like, I'm going to play the Jew card. Finally, I have a reason to use this card.
Well, it's so interesting, though, because that connects me to something that I wanted to ask you about sort of independently of this, which was your speaking out against copyright and the way that you have framed that as permission. Am I getting this right? That it's a permission culture, that we have to seek permission to use this material and create art with it. And that in a way, you were experiencing that with Sita Sings the Blues as a non-Hindu versus, in sort of where the Hindus were saying, you don't have your Hindu card. And so, in that sort of perspective, you say, okay, but I have my Jew card, so I can explore a Jewish topic. And yet, I think that one of the things that's motivating us to work on this podcast is that we so often encounter that within even the Jewish world, that there's a lot of people who are told or feel about themselves that even though they are Jewish, they don't have permission to play around with the Jewish material because they're, quote, not Jewish enough or not learned enough. And at least on that score, you don't seem to be inhibited by that. Lex and I have been playing around with this idea of the chutzpah versus knowledge curve. And that to really fool around with this Jewish material, you either have to have not enough knowledge to know that it really takes a lot of chutzpah to do that, or so much knowledge that you kind of come to a point where you realize, oh, it actually is our tradition to be mucking around with this material. And so having a lot of chutzpah really is our tradition. And in the middle, you often have a lot of people who are inhibited or self-inhibited because somehow they don't have enough inner chutzpah to overcome whatever amount of knowledge they do or don't have. And so I'm just sort of wondering how you, because we were already, even though you've been working on this for 2 years already, you're still not sure how many parts of the Seder there are. But nevertheless, here you are spending, 4 years of your life making a feeature film about it. And so, right, that kind of stuff isn't getting in your way. And I'm just curious about how you think about that.
Okay, so, this idea of it's our tradition to muck about with this. The one way that I relate to Exodus that is meaningful for me is it's the story, in addition to being the story of the prophet and the survivors and, all the good Jews or Hebrews that learned how to obey Yahweh and all that stuff. It's also the story of a stiff-necked people. It's also the story of all the people that were Hebrews and were despised and were not doing what they were told and were making golden calves and probably worshiping Asherahs and doing all this naughty, bad stuff. And no matter how many times they were slain, they just kept coming along and doing that, right? Bad, bad, bad. They're Hebrews also. That's my tradition, right? Like, apparently people like me have been around, have been in the Hebrew community since before the Exodus, and they were never able to actually get rid of them. So that's me, a stiff-necked person.
Could you flesh out a little bit of what you're talking about with permission culture? Because we've talked about it specifically in this context of the Jewish community, but you make some really eloquent arguments about it in a broader sense and how it relates to artists. And I'm curious if you could talk about those, and then we can sort of reflect them back into the kinds of Jewish issues specifically that we're talking about.
Well, we basically are information receivers and transmitters, and we receive information like music or talk, language, whatever, through our senses, and we transmit it through speaking and writing and drawing and singing. And we form a network, right? We're analogous to neurons in a great mind. And when we block that, when we make that illegal or shut down through self-censorship, then we are not receiving and transmitting at our proper human potential. I do want to say that the Jewish aspect of this project is that I was raised observing Passover and that my parents were Jewish. But the story of Exodus, it's Abrahamic. I mean, it's all of them. It's all the Abrahamic religions. So it's not really an exclusively Jewish thing. Passover is, which doesn't make sense to me, actually, why Jews would be the only Abrahamic branch left that observes Passover when it's such a mandate.
It's true.
But I do wonder, like, I can't stop calling myself Jewish because I am. Like, there's something about me that is Jewish. I'm under no pressure to identify or not identify. Like, it's completely up to me. We're not in a political situation. I feel we're not in a political situation where it's at all dangerous to be Jewish. Other people would disagree with me. So I don't feel any pressure to join ranks with the tribe and, us against them. I don't feel that at all. But it also seems like, well, it's what I am. It's like I've got size 9.5 feet. It's just what it is. And I am thinking a lot more about atheism.
Please.
Should I just ramble here because I have okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, with my dad dying, I was like, well, I'm going to explore what was my dad about, right? I'm going to go explore my dad's roots. And I thought, cool that my dad was from like a super religious family. Thus far, I have had a bit of a turning point in understanding my father's background and my father's religion. And what I realized, my father really was an atheist. He was like a hardcore atheist, and I get it now more than I ever did before. But when I was growing up, you could not really say that you were an atheist in polite company. And when I was in grade school, my parents would say, remember, you don't have to do the Easter project, right? Like at grade school, public grade schools, they would still have the Christmas craft project and the Easter craft project. And my parents would say, just tell the teacher you're Jewish. You don't have to do it. Tell the teacher you're Jewish. And I think what would have been more accurate is if they'd said, tell the teacher you're atheist. You don't have to do this because you're atheist. But that never would have flown.
No, it's funny. You spoke about your own family, and I was thinking about mine, selfishly. But I was thinking about when I was 4 or 5 years old, Purim was coming up. And my family wasn't particularly observant of all sorts of holidays growing up, but I went to Sunday school, and so I was a little bit familiar, as much as any 4 or 5 year old can be, with sort of what Purim is. I knew you got to dress up in a costume, basically, and I knew the names like Mordechai and Esther from the story. And I remember I was visiting my grandparents on spring break, because that's when Purim is, in Florida. And we were like sitting around the table, and for some reason I was talking about Esther from the Purim story. And I'll never forget it. And my mom actually still tells this story. One of my grandparents was like, who are you talking about? Who's Esther? And I turned to them and I said, are you Jewish? To my own grandparents. Because at the time, like, to me, I'm like, Jews know this story. Like, this is part of our story. It was just part of something that I had internalized. But, like, do I think that Jews need to know the Esther story now? No, I don't. Do I think that by being Jewish, somehow that story is, like, part of me? I kind of do. And like you said, I don't know what to make of that. I don't know how to sort of take those two facts that, you know, people could totally not have any connection to the story at all, but still it would be there deep down somehow for them. I don't know, but it's like this funny thing about Jewishness.
I've never observed Purim. I have never been to a Purim party, never done it. All we did was Passover. But like our Jewish identity, what it mostly was that we weren't Christian, because I grew up in central Illinois, and it was like, we are clearly not Christian, which, funnily enough, also brings me back to Exodus, because so much of Exodus and all of the books of Moses is about not being like your neighbors. And that's a tradition we've carried on. I don't know if it's such a great tradition.
It's really interesting as I was hearing, you know, as I was thinking about you describing how troubling you found the Exodus story, and then I'm thinking about the traditional Seder material, you know, the Haggadah, and that it actually doesn't use the Exodus story from the book of Exodus to tell the Exodus story. It instead uses this kind of short recap from the book of Deuteronomy. And
Deuteronomy's no picnic
either, but that particular 4 or 5 line part is not full of the violence. You know, there's something I think about the signs and wonders and probably plagues, if I'm recalling, but it doesn't go through, you know, the gory details of the whole story. And I wonder if maybe that was intentional, you know, because the people who developed the Haggadah text were as troubled by the story, or didn't really want to spend the evening with the children telling that part of the story either.
Yeah, well, in this way, it reminds me a lot of the Ramayana, because there are many tellings of the, and I don't know if you've seen Sita Sings the Blues.
I have, yeah.
You have? Okay, so I don't know if you know this, but many tellings of the Ramayana omit what I consider the most interesting part of the story, also the most problematic part of the story, which is Ram's banishment of Sita and her subsequent, you know, calling on Mother Earth to take her back into her womb. Because you can't reconcile this, right? Like, a lot of people, they're just like, Ram's the hero. He was great. He was awesome. He rescues Sita. They move back to Ayodhya. Happily ever after, the end. But there's this other part, this later part, which is not like that beginning part. And it's really troubling, but really interesting for that reason. And yeah, Exodus is the same way. You know, I grew up with the Seder story, and it's like, and then they crossed the Red Sea and they were free. Whee! You know, like, they lived happily ever. I mean, not happily ever after. They lived, you know,
with other troubles,
struggly forever after. But yeah, but it's like they just don't talk about what happens next. And what happens next is pretty bad. Like, I did not know about the Levites killing. I didn't know that there was like all this Jew on Jew killing. That these people that had been liberated, you know, yay, finally we've crossed the sea, we're free now. It's like, no, now your head's cut off.
I'm thinking about Sita Sings the Blues and how I really loved the part with, you know, the people who are accused of being self-hating Hindus, where they're trying to remember the story and they're, you know, saying, oh, didn't this happen? And no, I think it was this. And they're, you know, they're talking and it felt very much to me like the same way that I would imagine Jews talking about the Exodus story, you know, really trying to fully wrap their minds around, you know, we do this Seder every year, right? It's the one thing that most Jews actually do every year. And yet somehow, right, they don't really know a lot of the details, which actually aren't in the Haggadah. Could really almost imagine the same conversation going on, you know, what, that happened? I didn't know about that, you know, and, you know, and then ultimately look, you know, well, what does it all mean? I mean, what is it all for, you know, and which is where I hear you standing today.
The conversation of my Hindu friends for Sita, that was so familiar. In fact, I had so many really, really familiar conversations. And there's a lot of just cultural parallels in first, second generation Indian immigrants in the US and American Jews. We're the same, except that I'm 1 or 2 generations further down. You know, like their kids or grandkids will be in a situation more like mine. But yeah, there's this thing with like the model minority, the doctor, the lawyer, the be really good in school. I met a lot of people who, you know, were Hindu Americans who reminded me so much of myself and my family culturally.
I've felt very similarly and had never really touched base with anybody about it, but I think there are some major parallels, and I'm almost curious if somebody has researched them. It seems like it's got to be something that people have explored, these parallels between the Hindu community and Jewish community, sort of bridging the generations. And what's interesting is I actually have a close friend whose family is Hindu and who is sort of, as you're speaking, devoutly atheist, and sounds a lot like how you're describing your dad. Actually, I'm going to have to touch base with him, but yeah, there's some similar parallels.
There's also like the pressures that are put on women, like the women are expected to carry on the religion, and
right.
You know, the disappointed grandma, and the guilt trips, and you know who you're supposed to marry.
Right. It just gets at a point that I think is so important, which is that, you know, the extent to which Judaism is unique and separate from the rest of the world might be a bit of an overstatement sometimes. We think of our own immigrant experience, you know, 1880s through 1920s, and it's so paradigmatic, and we sort of look back on it as this unique Jewish thing over a few decades, and we just think of it in our own world. But there's this clear parallel in the last few decades with the American Hindu. I don't know how exactly the immigration wave has worked in terms of Hindus coming to the U.S. numbers wise, but it's certainly similar. And we can learn a lot from that. We can learn a lot about ourselves by really looking into that. So I love that you have done this work, both looking at the Ramayana and the Torah.
So here's something that I say that's controversial, a controversial opinion of mine. You know, I spent all these years looking at Ramayana-related art, making this Ramayana movie, and then approached Exodus. And there is no contest in terms of who has the more and better art, religious art. It's no contest. I mean, there's like so much diversity of Hindu art. It's everywhere. And the no graven images issue, you know, I am of the opinion that has had a real effect on religious art. I mean, it's obviously had an effect on religious art. This is a controversial thing to say because anti-Semites like Hitler said that, you know, it's because Jews are just inferior, and you can tell because not enough art. But I think this has also impacted Christian art. It's obviously impacted Muslim art. It's a problem with Abrahamic art. So I'm sort of doing like a big, maybe comparative religion experience because I'm not coming to, I'm not reading Exodus just with, you know, my American background. I'm reading it after being immersed in a bunch of Hindu art, and the contrast is stark.
We've talked about other Jewish cultural prohibitions that permeate the Jewish subconscious in deep ways, such as the idea of not mixing things, right? Not mixing milk and meat, not mixing wool and linen, and not mixing Jews and non-Jews, right? And that these things kind of become these, one of our previous guests talked about them as these kind of embodied notions, right? That your body actually feels revulsion or feels, a wrongness about doing these things. And what you just said made me, wonder if we actually have also have built to some extent this kind of sense that art is not a Jewish thing.
Well, there's a lot of Jewish artists. A lot. I mean, and there have been for a long time. It's just there's not Jewish art isn't the same. Where you see the most visual exuberance is in Catholic art. There's a lot more austerity. I mean, there's also, really austere Christian traditions, right? Like Calvinism. But the thing with Hinduism is that you connect to the divine through pictures. It's encouraged. But when I went to India, it was really profound how there's a big chunk of the world that lives in a way that in the West, we have been taught is over. We've been taught that this stuff is like old, right? Like, and even at this conference I was at recently, I was surprised by how Eurocentric it was. When people talked about polytheism, they're like, oh yes, well the Greeks did that, and then we stopped. Big part of the rest of the world didn't stop. I thought about this. There's this idea of like the sacred cow, right? This Western mockery of the Hindu reverence for cows. And I thought about the statue of the golden calf. And it's like everything that we do in the West is to like distinguish ourselves from this, right? Like this is the epitome of what we're not supposed to be like. And it's really amazing.
So let me ask you, I mean, based on that experience and that sensibility and being, an atheist Jewish artist who immersed herself in Hinduism and Hindu culture and art for a long period of time and then comes to Jewish material, do you feel that you're bringing something into the Jewish material now that you got out of that experience, or are you really just seeing the contrast?
I'm seeing the contrast, but also I just don't know how you can have a religion without goddesses. I just don't get it.
Say more about that.
I mean, yeah, that's what really struck me. Because I always read so much when I start a film, and I was reading my Joseph Campbell and, all these explanations of religion. It's just like, how can there be a major religion without goddesses? Like, this is a freaky turn of human events. This was human, religion was goddesses, fertility and things growing and the earth. And this was like when human beings conceived of divinity, it was either just female. a lot of scholars seem to think that first religions were, just female-centered. And then men, male gods came into it gradually as agriculture developed, and then you had male and female gods together, and then the male gods became more important, but there were still goddesses, and then, monotheism hit. But I just don't get how that can be compelling, especially when you have, 51% of the population is female. And it's like, how are they going to relate to this? It's just a stark absence.
Right. I mean, a lot of times that you think about it, was it just a founder effect, right? That for some reason there was a person who had a particular notion, right? And there's nothing better or worse about it, but then for some reason it caught on, right? And so it sort of reshaped everything in its image, but not because of some inherent value, but potentially because of some, circumstance. But one of the things that I'm thinking about as, I'm listening to you reflect on this is how much did biblical Judaism ever really catch on? Because one of the things that I'm thinking about is why do the other Abrahamic religions not celebrate Passover, or a version of Passover? And I'm not really sure exactly what the sort of natural history of Islam is in terms of what it drew from Judaism and what it didn't. But with Christianity, I think that actually the Seder as we know it didn't exist at the time that Judaism and Christianity diverged, and that the Seder is really a rabbinic construction, and that at the time, that Judaism and Christianity diverged, Passover was much more a sacrificial occasion. And, and essentially, right, the idea of the Passover sacrifice is that by making the sacrifice, we were protected from the angel of death during the plague of the firstborns. And in a sense, I think, right, Jesus takes that role. And so, in a sense, Judaism does celebrate the version of Passover that existed at the time that Judaism and Christianity diverged. And then Judaism sort of reworked Passover, and specifically reworked it, I think, in a way that kind of de-emphasizes a lot of the most troubling of the biblical material that you're talking about, in a similar way to, I think, the way that the rabbis de-emphasized the other troubling, one of the other troubling Jewish stories, the Hanukkah story and the Jewish civil war that was going on at that time, and the rabbis really didn't care much for the Maccabees. And so they switched Hanukkah from being this holiday that's about rededication of the temple or, killing Hellenists into a holiday that's about this miracle of a candle that stayed lit for 8 days. And I guess, as I'm thinking about this, I'm just thinking about how, in a way, the way that you're describing being so troubled by the material that you've really gotten into from the Bible, whether that actually is exactly the experience that the rabbis had about that material, which is why they changed so much of Judaism at that time, and that actually it was rabbinic Judaism that caught on and that actually had a lot of adherents, whereas that temple cult never really caught on that much.
That is very interesting. I have a question for you because you know more about this than I do. I thought that the Last Supper of Christ was famously a Seder, was famously a Passover Seder, and Jesus was, the rabbi leading the Seder. Is that bunk?
Traditionally, it's held to have happened on Passover. So in that sense, it was like a Passover meal. I think calling it a Seder might be a little bit anachronistic for the reasons that Dan's talking about, because so basically what we know is that a Seder certainly didn't exist in First Temple times, and we know that it did exist when the Mishnah was written down around 200 CE, 200 after, in the Common Era, some say AD. What we don't really know is when between there it specifically was created, because it had to have been created sometime before it was written down, but we don't know exactly when. So it could have been, a few hundred years before that, in which case I guess it could have been a Passover Seder of some kind, but it also could have been very shortly before it was the Mishnah was actually written down in 200, in which case it would have post-dated.
But there are different elements of the Seder. I mean, I think, right, because I think that there's at least a few different elements that now form the Seder that we have, right? There's the gathering together as a family to have a meal on this festival. That is the ancient observance, that they would come to a pilgrimage to the temple, they would sacrifice a lamb, and they would roast it and eat it. There was maybe the kind of transformational part of the Seder, and that's where Jesus holds up the wine, he says, "This is my blood," right? And he holds up is it bread, and says, "This is my body." It was, and that suggests to me, and I'm not a big expert in this, but that suggests to me that there was some element of the Passover gathering in which symbolic foods were eaten and were said to symbolize these dimensions of the Exodus. So my hypothesis is that those things existed at the time of the divergence between Judaism and Christianity, and that's why Christianity has Jesus as the stand-in for the Passover sacrifice and the Eucharist as the stand-in for that sort of symbolic food transformation. But then there's the other part, which is the telling of the Passover story, and it's not my impression that part existed until the rabbinic period, and that it certainly didn't exist as an organized text. And that's where and that actually one of the most sort of significant for the rabbis elements of it is that they were actually making a political commentary against the Romans at that time, and that right in their mind the Seder ritual was actually a Romana clef, where Egypt was the stand-in for Rome, and so they were able to say all these harsh things about the Romans by saying them about the Egyptians.
Man, so much. See, there I was thinking that it was it was after the Babylonian exile, and this stuff was written when Egypt was the enemy of their most, that the Hebrews or the Jews were a vassal state.
Well, I think that's when the Torah was written, and so potentially, right, the Torah is potentially a Romana clef, where the Egyptians are the stand-in, are either the stand-ins for the Babylonians, or it is that because Egypt was the enemy of the Babylonians, the Jews were trying to get in good with the Babylonians,
that's what I thought. I thought it was they were carriers of Babylonian anti-Egypt propaganda. That it's okay, you can go back now, but you're on you're on our team and they're the enemy.
What I'm really thinking about the film is like, I'm really interested in the position that you're in, being so troubled by this, because I feel like that point of view is one that, successive sort of generations of commentators, and I would even go beyond commentators, right? Because I would say like the ancient rabbis were actually like founding a new religion based on the old biblical religion, right? But quite a different one in all sorts of ways. And one of the moves that they made was to de-emphasize some of the blood and gore stuff that they didn't like either. So if we reach all the way back to the Bible as a sort of authentic Jewish story and find it revolting, in a way, I feel like we're actually reenacting the process that the rabbis went through in their own rejection of that version of Judaism. And so, on the one hand, I'm really sympathetic to the idea that leads to atheism, because actually I kind of think that the rabbis may have been atheists too, and they couldn't say it in quite that way. There's this concept of the increasing hiddenness of God, and so God is there, but he's completely hidden. I mean, that was basically the rabbis' point of view, and I think they couldn't say that they were atheists. So that's obviously controversial. I don't know that Lex agrees with this, but so anyway, like I think it's so fascinating to kind of think about like, how does a modern person who is happy to declare themselves to be an atheist, actually sort of look back at this material and, potentially rework it in a way that actually could matter for us today. I mean, that's why I'm so fascinated about the potential of an artist to work with this material.
I've told people that, one good thing about Exodus is that it's like just one step. It practically is atheism, right? Because it takes all these gods, and it's like, all those ridiculous gods, that's just silly. That's just ridiculous. There's one, maybe, and you can't see it, and text only, and don't make any pictures. And I'm like, close.
That's right. So we are running out of time, and so I wanted to get to our wrap up, but I wanted to give you a chance, Nina, if you have any sort of final thoughts, whether related to Seder Masochism or atheism or any of the pieces that we've touched on today, to let you have your sort of closing statement of sorts, if you'd like.
Well, not a closing statement, but this has been a great conversation, because I keep getting ideas as I'm working on the movie, and I'll talk to people about it, and usually what people say is, that's dumb, that's wrong. But clearly you're thinking about all kinds of weird things in relation to Judaism. So it's been really fun to talk to you.
Well, it's been really fun for us too.
Yeah, it really has. We've laughed a lot this episode and learned a lot, I think, too. So thank you to Nina Paley for coming on. And we want to close out, as we always do, by encouraging our listeners to please be in touch with us. And there's a few ways for you to do that. First is through our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second is by heading to our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@nextjewishfuture.org and lex@nextjewishfuture.org. And we also want to encourage you to think about supporting us. We always appreciate gifts, and you can do so through our Patreon account. And you can find that at patreon.com/JudaismUnbound. So thank you for listening, and this has been Judaism Unbound.